The Oregon Investment Education Board. Investment Education Board will come to order. Seth, would you call the roll, please?
Governor Kitzhofer.
Here.
Nancy Golden.
Here.
Richard Alexander. Julia Britt Edwards. Yvonne Curtis.
Here.
Matt Donegan. Samuel Henry.
Here.
Nicole Maher.
Here.
Mark Mulvihill.
Here.
David Reeves.
Here.
Ron Saxton.
Here.
Mary Spildy. Kay Turan. Hannah Bendren.
Here. Julia and Mary are on their way. They'll be here any second.
Very good. A couple of housekeeping issues. As some of you may know, Josette Green has resigned as the executive director of the Oregon Student Access Commission, and the commission has appointed Bob Rue as the interim ED, and he will be an ex officio member of our board. Welcome. Thank you with us. We also need to adopt or approve the minutes from the September 11th meeting. Have you had a chance to take a look at those?
So moved.
Nope.
No.
I'll wait for discussion.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we adopt the meetings of the September 11th meeting. Discussion, Hannah?
Yeah, I was not noted as president. I was president.
Okay, without objection, we'll correct the minutes to reflect that Hannah Band wasn't back there. Other discussion? Objection? The first item of business action item is this temporary rule on the Parents' Role in Achievement Complex. I'm sorry that I missed the conclusion of that conversation at the last meeting. I do believe that if we're going to be successful in organizing the school and communities around shared goals and achievement compacts, have got to be the result of a pretty transparent, inclusive process that involves educators and students and parents and community members. Because I'm not sure that the state and community colleges and universities can do it all on their own. I don't think we have the resources or the leverage, or probably not all the knowledge. So I think it's important to provide opportunities to sort of broaden the input into the development of the compacts. I'm also very cognizant of our legal opinion that makes it very clear that the OAB can't adopt a rule that requires formal parental involvement with the development of achievement compacts. And I understand that the board at our last meeting after I had left has recommended some legislation to clarify that, but also that you've been working on some language in a temporary rule that might be more acceptable to the board. So without objection, I'll have Nancy run through that.
Sure. So this is under number 3 in your packet, and first of all, I just want to acknowledge how great the packets look this time. And I know Kathleen, you had a lot to do with that, and Rudy, so I appreciate that. It's really helpful. I think the biggest idea around the language is that what we hold sacred is that parents need to be involved. Basically, what this allows us to do is to say, holding that value, we're going to let districts determine what's the best way to involve parents, and then they would communicate that on the narratives that will go in with each of the achievement compacts. Why I really support this language is different districts do some pretty great stuff around parent involvement, and this would allow us, after we get our compacts back, to see what those are. So, for example, I know Sandy from Salem Kaiser uses listening groups where she brings in parents who represent the diversity in the community and listens to the parents about what are the strategies we really need to do to move the dials for kids. So I just think this would allow us to really look at many different models and in the end help us learn about what might be the most powerful way to really engage parents. So that is what this language does, and so we've zigzagged between a number of us just to see if this is something we think could work, and we do. So I'd love to hear how the rest of the group feels about it. And Julia, are you on the phone? I know Julia really wanted to be in this conversation because she was very involved in it the last time. So,
is anybody on the phone? Anybody at all? Okay, there's Julie has a call number.
Yeah, and I think, staff, did you call Julia?
I called in the conference line, yeah, so she has the number, she should be able to call.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe we could hear from other people and then we would hear from Julia.
Anyone else have thoughts on this? I wasn't involved in drafting this.
I would just like to support that. I'm really glad that we're moving this direction in acknowledging and holding the value of parents being involved in the process. And I do think there's great diversity in how each district handles that, and a lot of that has to do with size. So I think this allows us to do that. I also especially appreciate the part where we're asking for an inclusion of a brief description of the parent engagement strategy to ensure that that parent engagement does occur in every single school district.
Is there hand?
I think the comment around the ability of some larger districts, and some of our larger districts have been engaged in a process talking about equity for some time now through Harvard, and there are also other groups out there at equity, and part of our conversation at the last meeting was making sure that we get all of our parents engaged in this process, and a way to engage districts in a conversation about some of those opportunities that they have, maybe from their colleagues in larger districts who have reached out and done some of this work. But we've talked about poverty and the minority community. We went to Portland, we heard loud and clear that the community did not believe that they'd been heard. And so what are we going to do as a board to insist that all parents be involved in this process is part of what I hope that we can work with COSA and the School Board Association to make sure that that is successful.
Our last conversation was heavily focused on parents, and thank you for pulling this together and kind of grabbing our thoughts. But there are some words in here too that also refer to community. In particular, at the very end, the summary of the recommendations received from parents and the community. I guess I just need to be clear. What we're talking about are the constituents on the Achievement Compact Advisory Committee, correct? That's what we're talking about.
Go ahead.
So I think in general what we're talking about is what's the process to engage parents. It wouldn't necessarily be on the committee, but it does assume however you engage parents, you take the data you gain from their conversation to the committee.
Okay. Is that parents and the community or parents?
Well, at this point, we're talking about parents.
Okay, because it does say at the end, received from parents and the community at the very end. I mean, I hope I'm not nitpicking. I just want to make sure we're clear on what's the breadth of the involvement on this process.
Well, I think what's critical is that parents, and I think if it has community there, that parents are part of the community, that we really get to hear from them. What are the conditions for their children and what are their ideas about how children really, their children, what we need to do as districts in order to help move the dial for their children.
Now, I wasn't obviously there part of drafting this, but I think, obviously the flashpoint of the conversation was focused on parents.
Right.
But I also think that, as we've said before, the Achievement Compact really is an invitation to the full community to be engaged in this, because there are a lot of resources in that community that if they could all be brought to bear on trying to improve student success, then I think that's what's going to Yes. Nicole, sorry.
So I generally support the language. I think the language is as strong as it possibly can be, considering the limitations that we have at this point. I do support it with the caveat that we will move forward with legislative action to make sure that we have parents with a full and equal vote. While I appreciate the language and while I know that most school districts go forward with their parent engagement efforts with the best intent, I also know that many times what is perceived as the best intent by a district is really defined in a majority cultural way of engaging parents, and it doesn't always work. And I know we have so far to go in the state in engaging the diverse populations that live here in a different way, a more effective way. And as a
Yes, and the issue that Mark raised really is about the provision of materials to the community and to parents. And as I said at the last meeting, I think that these are likely public meetings and these are public records probably. So it's just a way, I think, to cement that as a clarification to the districts.
Anyone else?
Looking for a motion, Governor?
Julia, have you arrived?
Seth is trying to get her on the cell phone right now.
I assume she has something that's important that we postpone it until she
Yeah, let me just, because I spoke to her just before I came, so let me just put her voice into the room. What she really wanted was, she is where you are, Nicole, which eventually we should have parents involved in the committee. She respects the fact it might take us a while, that this is the best language we can do right now, but she really does see a lot of power in parents having equal voice about achievement of students. And what I think is if we adopt this as a temporary rule, it will really give us the time to think together about what should we do in terms of legislation.
So moved.
It is moved. Do we have a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded that we adopt the proposed temporary rule as
Here she is.
Julia?
Yeah, my apologies.
That's
I went to McNary.
That's right. We have a motion to adopt this rule, and it's been seconded, so we'll just put you on under the category of discussion.
And I'm assuming the language is as it was sent out.
Yes, it is.
I think it was well crafted, and I'm very supportive.
Very good. And just for your edification, Nicole is also supporting the caveat that we go forth with legislation that seeks to make parents full and equal partners in this down the road. And I think in our discussion we concluded that this temporary rule gives us an opportunity to think together about how best to achieve that as we move forward.
Excellent.
Okay.
A good outcome.
Very good. Is there an objection to the motion?
No.
So ordered. Very good. I'm sorry, Hannah. I apologize.
I'm assuming it was just the motion that you stated, nothing further than the
No.
motion to adopt the
Just the
temporary,
motion,
right?
yeah, to clarify, the motion was simply to adopt the language as it is
Great.
reflected
Thank
in
you.
the standard. I'm sorry. The next agenda item is receipt of information for discussion purposes on the efforts to develop a statewide longitudinal database, and we have some folks from FLT Consulting who are going to make a presentation to us. Will you come forward?
Thank you. Thank you, Governor, members of the board. My name is Rick Anderson. I am a principal with FLT Consulting based out of Olympia, Washington. Before I get into the recommendations, I want to start by saying, just on behalf of my team, just how honored we are to be here today. Oregon has embarked on a very ambitious and laudable goal, and it's just really a privilege and an honor to be part of that, so thank you. I want to very quickly, I know time is short, but I want to very quickly give you some context in terms of who we are, what we did, and how we did it. I am the project manager of a staff of a team of 5, and so let me introduce them in absentia. We have Gil Dean and Lori Boehm and Bill Richmond from Trinan Associates. They're our subject matter experts on this project. Gil is a data warehouse expert. He is an embedded consultant with OSPI in Washington, running their longitudinal data system. And Lori Boehm is also a P20 data expert. She is an embedded consultant with the Department of Early Learning in Washington State on their component of the longitudinal data system. Bill Richmond is a CPA with 15 years experience on IT projects. Lisa Kasababian is a research analyst with FLT Consulting, and myself serving as project manager. So in terms of the what, we were asked to do 2 different tasks. The first was to make recommendations on enhancing your statewide longitudinal data system. And the second was to estimate the cost for budgeting purposes, the cost of operating and maintaining that system, as well as the cost of enhancing it going forward. In terms of the how, in terms of the enhancement recommendations, our first assignment was to digest a very voluminous set of written materials around the history of this project. We then had a full day of meetings down in the Portland and Salem arena. That was our opportunity to meet with Dr. Crew. We've had 2 formal meetings with the Alder Executive Committee, and we've conducted a series of mostly one-on-one phone interviews, and you can see the folks that we've talked to on the back of the report. And I think that's tab 4. So, and then in terms of the how of our budgeting estimates, we looked at historical cost data going back to 2005, looking at the different data technology and initiatives run by ODE. Those include KIDS, OFAR, data, and the Alder grant that's before you now. So going to the report, you can see from the title that our central recommendation is that Oregon move aggressively to create a one-stop, single login site or portal to view P20 information. And as part of that, our recommendation is to, much in the same way that the OEIB has come together around a common agenda, that a broader P20 technology consortium come together to build that portal. So if you look at the first page of our recommendations, and I guess to give you a bit of the context for our central recommendation, is that as we look at the policy landscape in Oregon around education, it's undergone a sea change. And you now have a common agenda with a very laudable goal that every student leaves the system with a diploma of one kind or another. You have a system of shared measurements to keep you on track on your goal, and you have a clear charter through the OEIB to align activities across organizations to produce measurable outcomes. So broadly, in terms of this alignment, what we've seen is that you've taken these individual systems of early learning, K-12, post-secondary, and you've essentially created a broader single system focused on student achievement. And what we're proposing, in short, is that we make that same transition with the technology side of this. The historical landscape of the statewide longitudinal data system is one of technology projects, a series of technology projects driven mostly through federal grants. And the technology people in charge of this have been put in this position, I think difficult position, of figuring out not only what to build, but how to build it. And so, again, we're proposing that on the technology side, we take the same jump that's already occurred on the policy side. So going to the specific recommendations then, and then taken as a whole, what our recommendations should be considered is some very specific recommendations for this biennium around a direction and a common vision, and then a series basically of roadmap directions, more general directions for the next 2 biennia. So for this biennium, we are proposing that the technology leadership comes under the OEIB as a strategic component of its broader mission. As part of that, we recommend that you hire a chief information officer within the OEIB to direct the development of an integrated P20 information system. We recommend that you create a P20 Information Users Council to make information on what should be built, that is the future functionality of the system. We recommend that you create an education technology consortium, a P20 consortium, to voluntarily and collaboratively build an integrated P20 information system. In order to do that, you'll have to aggressively seek some vendors, a public-private partnership to do this. So we recommend that you engage the Department of Administrative Services, and specifically the State Procurement Office, to work to expedite the contract negotiations so you can bring on this private talent. We also recommend that you establish an enterprise fund available to the OAB to make strategic investments in this P20 information system. I'll get into a little bit more detail about that, about the content of that enterprise system later in the presentation. So again, in terms of the information system itself, we see that the vision that's possible for you is to create a single login system that is essentially a portal for all the different information one would find across the P20 spectrum, and that those should directly support your education and achievement compact goals. So we see initially that what's possible is to have the portal display your achievement compact information and report card information, and that would come from the longitudinal data system. We would see that you create a set, and this is on the technology consortium side, create a set of operational rules around the development of this portal. So, and this, I guess, is sort of a plug-and-play concept. You're going to have a number of systems that you already have to connect into this portal, but over the next coming years, you're going to see a number of additional systems come online and tools come online that you're going to want to plug into this system. So that work should happen now to create that sort of operational framework to facilitate down the road. We would recommend that you connect the portal to the student information systems and that are either managed by the state and your local and regional education providers. And in terms of professional development and research, we recognize that Oregon has had a very successful experience in terms of getting data training out across the P20 spectrum, including parents and community members. And we think that this is absolutely essential. If you're going to invest in a longitudinal data system, you want everybody within the P20 spectrum, including the parents and the community, to understand how to use that data. So we would advocate continuing investments in that activity. We also recommend that you create a research team to use the longitudinal data system, and you have a set of budget proposals from, I think, 5 different agencies, and those are included as policy option packages before you. So if you flip to the next page and look at sort of what you would have following these recommendations in the fall of 2013 is the basic framework of a one-stop P20 system. It would be operational and it would report basic outcomes to the public. So you would see here that there would be a secure access, and depending on the role that you are in terms of whether you're a student or a public or a teacher, administrator, you'd get to see different information. That portal would be connected to the longitudinal data system, and you'd have different components, data from early learning, K-12, and post-secondary that were connected to that longitudinal data system. We also understand that there is a debate about student information systems and whether or not those should be state-run or local-run, and that currently there is a very small state instance that supports a small number of students in the state of Oregon. The bulk of Oregon citizens are served by different state information systems. And basically, we're recommending that through this P20 technology consortium, that there's a discussion about how best to use that. And that might be, it might stay local, it might go state, or there might be a third way around this sort of plug-and-play framework where there might be a third way about how to manage that system. Looking more broadly, going into the next biennium, the 2013-2015 biennium, we see that the P20 information system would add functionality to support student achievement and professional development directly around the goals that you have, and that outcomes would be, again, transparently reported to the public. You see from this puzzle diagram that there is additional functionality added. There's possibility of adding and maybe consolidating fiscal and financial and human resources information. You see on the early learning that as the kindergarten readiness assessment is available, that gets plugged into the early learning component of this. And that on the bottom that you see some additional tools that are in the offing that might be ready for the next biennium, specifically web-based tools around intervention strategies, instructional framework, assessments, and college and career readiness. Looking out to the broader, to the next biennium, the 2015-2017, you see that functionality continues to be added. We've got the icon of the smartphone to say that this is going to be, more and more available on different sorts of technology components, so it's more widely available to the public and practitioners within the P20 environment. Moving over to the budget side, again, we were tasked with identifying the costs of maintaining the system that you're building, and based on our analysis, we would recommend a staff of 10.5 FTE going forward, which would represent an annual ongoing cost of around $1.2 million. You've got some federal funds immediately. You've got about $8.2 million of federal funds that are unspent from the Alder grant. Our scenario basically assumes that you're going to get a one-year extension to spend that money, and so we've split that up roughly 50-50. In terms of the enhancement team, we recommend a staff of 9 FTE and 4 contractors to build these enhancements. You can see that that ongoing cost is around $4 million a year, which includes a fairly significant $1.5 million around professional development and data integration. We also are advocating for some sort of enterprise fund, perhaps bond funded, to make additional investments in the P20 information system. I think as you take a look at this might go hand in hand with the progress that's made around creating a P20 information or technology consortium. If that really starts to gather some steam, then you'll want to really invest in that. If that doesn't, if that idea doesn't really capture people's imagination here, then that would probably be less likely. But ways that you, sort of cost centers that could go into the enterprise fund include the chief information officer, the purchase of state student information systems if local school districts and ESDs choose to go that route, purchase of web-based assessment and other educator evaluation tools. These are web-based tools that will be coming online in the near future. Contracts with the P20 consortium to build parts of this system. And again, I think it's important not to see this as a state portal or a state system, but very much a partnership modeling what you've done on the policy side with the OEIB. There are other potential things that you could use with this enterprise fund, including cost to migrate data and cost to subsidize connectivity costs for remote districts. There is some budget detail on the following pages around the summary that show in this 2012-2017 summary is basically in the categories of first, maintenance and operation. I mentioned that it's around $1.1 million. This first fiscal year, the purple color here, basically that's already been budgeted, as have been the federal funds in fiscal year 13-14. Then you see a breakout of the maintenance and operation costs as well as the enhancement costs. So with that, I'll close and be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Sam?
I just want to get my head around the whole piece, and could you just take about a minute and a half and walk me through a scenario where a policy question that comes from here would be answered by the provision of this new system?
Sure. Well, I can tell you sort of where the system is today. And the Elder Project's in the process of migrating the data elements over into basically into a bucket so that those questions can be answered. The next step that hasn't happened yet is to do the kinds of modeling that you'd need to do to answer real live policy questions. So on the current course of things, that's not likely to happen by this fall. So we're proposing a more ambitious acceleration to make that happen this year. And so that would include the spending of, say, the $4 million of federal funds, contract with some private folks, get that going. So that's the first part of that. The second is operationally, we do think it is important to separate the what from the how. And that currently hasn't happened to a great extent. So that's why we're recommending hiring a chief information officer who would have one leg in the what group and one leg in the how group. And that group would then really from more of a 10,000 foot level say, these are the questions the system needs to answer at a very practical level. So we're proposing that, and that is an acceleration over the current pace of what's happening right now.
And that would be after the discussions about whether to base it mostly locally or at state level.
Well, I guess what we're, the vision that we're trying to promulgate here is that on the technology side, it needs to mirror what you all have done on the policy side, and that has not happened. It is, while you're involving folks, it's not a partnership yet. And while the technology side has been run very well, I think it's unfair to have them run both of the what and the how. And so you need to make that split between the what and the how. But the how group then needs to be not the state agency. It shouldn't be the Department of Education building this thing. The portal needs to get built as a partnership. And if that partnership takes place, now you're mirroring what's happened on the policy side, and the information is really just a tool to serve what you all are trying to accomplish on the policy side. But until you sort of make that transition, it's not going to connect to what you're doing on the policy side.
So just to answer Dr. Henry's question, as we look at our budget, there's a recommendation around an investment in early reading. So this data system would be able to help us see, based on an additional investment, did we move the dial? Is that the sort of policy questions that could be answered through the system?
Absolutely, yes.
So I think as we look at the budget recommendations, then we need to say, how do we make sure the data system lets us see if our investments are going the right way? So,
This might be obvious, but I think one of the obvious pieces of the information you just shared is that currently, without the system, we don't have a way of doing that. And that has been a block even at the K-12 level in our districts, because everything we do is district by district, the systems aren't integrated, they don't talk to one another. We try to do that in consortiums, it just doesn't always work perfectly. So I think that was a great question, and I think it's real important for us to know, because I know it's hard to look at big numbers when we know we're in such desperate need in our school districts and across the P20 system. But this is the kind of work that needs to be done and needs to be done collaboratively, because if this work isn't done, we're kind of at a dead stop in terms of really driving policy forward quickly.
Anna?
So is the data that we're collecting to inform instruction of students?
I'd say yes. I think all the data elements needed to inform instruction are in the process of being gathered and basically made available. So that is on course to happen under basically the current pace of things.
Okay, so then in the list of interviewees, we don't have any educators. And I think this is one of the things that we talked about. If we're going to collect data, it needs to actually be functional out in the trenches with the kids. And my concern is, at what point do we intend on going out to the practitioners to figure out what is it that helps inform their instruction? Because it's not standardized test scores. That's very clear, I believe. So when are we going to get out and actually ask them? Because if I look at this correctly, we're looking at investing $83 million total.
Well, so let me start with make a distinction between data and information, because I think that's the point that you're making. And right now, in order to get the information, there's a lot of work to get the data in place and to have the kind of data you need in the way that you need it to be useful as information. So that is happening. Our recommendations to you are to create basically this what committee to be able to basically have that ability, that capacity to say, what is the most important things we want to know from this data? What information, and that's the value of a longitudinal data system, data goes in, and if you do it right, and information comes out. But it has to be modeled to provide the information that you want. And technology folks shouldn't be in charge of that. So we are, I think, on the same page here through the creation of a group, basically the Information Users Council, which I think should absolutely include teachers to say, what information do we need from this data to be in line with the mission that you have, which is to raise student achievement and professional development?
So we're going to invest all the money, create all of this before we've actually asked the practitioners. I guess that's my point. I think we're a little ahead of how much we actually need to create. Because in the professional learning communities, for instance, out in the schools, they have different information that they want. So I'm just saying, let's not build the airplane before we have the specifications of what's needed for it to be successful in flight.
My understanding is that the data elements in themselves of what you need, that's not controversial. What's needed is the kind of what they call dimensional modeling around how do you slice and dice data to get the information you need. And that currently is not planned to happen before fall of 13. And given OEIB's very ambitious and goals, that's why we are recommending that this needs to happen now, that right now, before this biennium's over, you need to create the what committee to figure out what information you would like this system to really provide.
And is it 83 million? Is that the total investment?
The total investment that we're showing is on the 2012-17 summary, which includes a combination of state and federal funds, including this particular year, which has already been budgeted. So if you include this year's, it would be a total of $50 million.
So the other to the enhancement is embedded in this?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And Mark?
Two questions. First one, was there any discussion about infrastructure in the state, such as some of the rural and remote areas, not enough bandwidth? Was there any discussion on the actual implementation of the needed infrastructure issues?
Well, I mean, one of the decisions that I think that you have before you is, are you going to take, every student? There are some students in the smaller districts that aren't served by student information systems, that don't have teachers, that are getting online, as I understand it, a fair bit of online instruction. And so it's if you're going to take every student, how do you go about doing that? So that's one of the issues before
So there was
you.
discussion about that, but there wasn't really any plan on the infrastructure aspect of it.
Not in a detailed way, other than to take a look at the provision of basically a state-run student information system, and can you move some of those students onto that system?
Okay. Second question, when we were first looking at longitudinal databases, a subcommittee of OEIB, we looked at models across the nation. There were very few that were P20. You had pieces like K-12, longitudinal, several states. Was there any research in other states that you found to help us with a P20? I mean, there are a lot of systems that are in this jigsaw puzzle that have to be fit together. And one thing I've learned about tech, you think tech can do it all. I have a phone, and in fact, it can't. And I was just curious on what you see nationally on P20 systems.
We have looked at what other states are doing, and they are grappling with this same kind of thing. But I think the fact of the matter is that the K-12 system is more broadly developed on the technology front. You're developing a lot of your early learning programs, as are other states right now, so that's going to be slower out of the gates. So it's a matter of constructing a system that as these come on, that you've got a way to connect them into a broader vision and a broader functionality, rather than sort of having to piecemeal everything together out into the future.
Eric, and then Mark.
Yeah, can you direct me here? I mean, obviously, community colleges and the university system, K-12 is already spending some money on data at the state level. So could you help me see where you're asking for additional investment over and above what we're already spending on? We don't have a system, but we are spending money on collecting data. And we all have different systems, so it would be helpful to know, if not today, but some other time, what we're spending now and what additional investment is necessary to create a zero-to-10 system. Or is it 50 million? Is that the figure for additional investment?
Well, again, the enterprise fund is a bit of a placeholder. We didn't do any systematic or scientific work to say that's the number. It's a placeholder. And again, we are, as part of the transition to catch technology up with policy, advocating for a P20 technology consortium. So the idea would be to spend that money, plus the federal money that you still have, hopefully for another year and a half, and spend that money plus what we're proposing in terms of state money on the development of that system.
Well, but let me just ask the question a different way. What does this assume about current money and people working on this? That this is all in addition to that, or this incorporates that?
Okay.
What are we doing about the current effort?
All right. So if I understand your question, so the line here on the 2012-17 enhancement team, that would be ODE staff. So this is $4 million a year going forward, beginning next biennium.
And those are all new?
It's what it is basically, it's basically that you've been getting a series of federal grants that's funded a team. And so in order, what we looked at is what would it cost to operate and maintain just the system with no enhancement? What staff would be needed?
But do we have people at ODE now?
Correct. This is basically the continuation of that team.
So that's where I'm still confused.
And are they all grant
How much of
funded?
this is continuation and how much is new?
Okay. So so basically, if we look at this chart, and on the left-hand column, you've got fiscal year in the purple, the current
We don't
year.
have color.
All right. Oh, sorry. So that's basically funded. You don't have to, that's already in there, so maybe that's confusing. Going forward, what would you have to spend? So the next figure in maintenance operations, $1.177 million. So that would be a cost going forward for the state of Oregon to maintain that system. So every year on out, in order to maintain the system that you've got, is approximately $1.1 million.
But if you didn't have your proposal and you never came today, wouldn't we still be spending some of that?
You would be spending that money if you wanted to maintain the system. Okay. Now, in that year, below that, it's the federal funds. So if you look at what you basically have right today, $8.2 million of federal funds. You have to spend that. If you get the extension, you get till June 30th of 2014 to spend that. That's Alder funds. So you've got that money to spend. So that essentially, you've got that money to spend on enhancements. So looking at the next, and there's not a line here, I'm sorry, but the next fund is the enhancement team. And so your decision here is, what we've done is say, going forward, an enhancement, we recommend $4 million. It may be that, depending on the pace you want to go, that you can use the federal funds this year, that next year, and say we're not going to fund it. But going forward to enhance this, based on what we're recommending, to keep this team intact and building systems, it's about $4 million a year. On top of that, we're saying if you want to engage this broader P20 consortium, you can spend another $5 million a year. So we originally had these as different scenarios, so maybe this is confusing to have this all in one, and we can maybe move back to the scenario approach, but we wanted to provide some different options here.
So I have, somebody else have a question? I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so then why in 13, 14? We've got the 4.1 million from the Alder funds that I see is ongoing, that you're saying if we get the extension, we can spend.
Right.
But then down below, there's an additional $4 million for that year. And then moving forward, 14, 15, we don't have the federal money anymore, and we've got that $4 million still. So are we doing a huge boost in that year? Is that why there's an additional $4 million?
That's one of the options, and I guess that's what we're recommending. Given the importance of information to help drive this system, and given this sort of landscape where technology needs to catch up to the policy so that it can serve what you're trying to do at a policy level, we are recommending that you expend aggressively next year. So basically, it's a double dip in a sense, where you're funding an enhancement team. You've got the federal funds, which are largely going to, my guess, contractors. And in addition, you could have an enterprise fund. That is clearly an option about how fast you want to go. You can see from the bottom line here that there's a pretty big ramp up, from $5 million this year just to $14 million next year. That's a big, and then it comes back down to around $10 million a year. That's a big ramp up. But the idea is to catch the technology up so that you have a platform, you have the information that educators and the public need to pursue your policy goals.
So I have a question. Oh, excuse me, Julie, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry.
So on a little bit different line, so I look at information as a really powerful tool for parents and school staff to help students. So I'm kind of looking at this from less of the educator standpoint, but more sort of how students and parents might interface with it. And I'm wondering about the plans to have parent and student data in the design of this authorized student data. Is it being presented in a way that's a useful real-time tool for parents and students? And then secondly, just in terms of the whole issue of privacy, I'm wondering if I didn't see in this packet or here in the presentation a discussion about what sort of sideboards would be on the privacy side. Is there going to be a policy developed? What sort of provisions do we have for preventing data breaches? It looks like a lot of people would have information. Who are the researchers who would have information to real-time student data, and what kind of sideboards will we be placing on that? Because I think if you think of your student's file in a physical office, you kind of know where it is and who has access to it, but when we're putting it up in a virtual space, what kind of boxes are we going to put around that so the access is appropriate, there's no linkage to people having parents getting access to lessons, but they have to then sign on to, so giving away student privacy or student information.
Right.
So it's a big topic.
So the first question has to do with training around the use of data. And so in this $4 million for the enhancement, we have included $1 million of professional, basically data training. And that would go out to educators and practitioners across the P20 spectrum, but it would also go out to parents in the community. Some of these grants that I've seen is there's training, I think the COSA is doing some work around the achievement compacts. That would be a place to do that. I think the school board, the Association of School Boards, I'm not remembering the acronym, is doing great work with the school boards, and which I think is a brilliant idea around teaching the school boards the importance of this data, because again, broadly what Dr. Crew is trying to do is change a culture around student achievement and raising the bar for student achievement, and having school boards support that is critical. Having them know the data and understand how to use it is part of that enabling environment that's going to allow for sustained success and sort of hold things together long enough to show some measurable progress.
And OEA's been the third partner in that work we've been doing together.
The second part of your question has to do with privacy, and we've indicated a secure login here. We note that Oregon has very strong privacy protections, and that there are federal protections, and that there is work being done by a number of groups, including the Alder Executive Committee, to make sure that privacy is protected. So we see that as in play and not really needing any particular further recommendations from us.
So I would encourage this body to proceed with the investment that we look into, sort of what sort of privacy sideboards we would want to have on the system, because I say, when I'm looking through here, it looks like there could be potentially a lot of people who have access to student level data, and I don't think, I want to see exactly how our privacy laws and federal laws apply to this data system. It's a powerful tool, but it can cut both ways.
And I think that's an issue that around the privacy and what Oregonians want, because we're talking about in the early childhood, tracking tracking children from the time they're born. And I think that's a conversation with Oregonians about making sure that they understand exactly what we're doing before we do it, so that we don't have issues later. And I would defer to our council to give us direction in that area.
My sense is that's another strong argument for the data training, so people do understand what's out there and how that should be used.
So $1 million you said was in for training?
That's included in the enhancement of the $4 million enhancement going forward.
So just to be clear, this is a proposal, and ultimately, anything that we want to do here has got to go through the legislature, the Ways and Means process. We're running into the same issues with our healthcare expansion. Sort of the policy is sort of outrun the data, and we know that we can dramatically reduce costs and increase quality, but you have to have data to actually be able to do it, which raises exactly the same questions about, privacy. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'd like to do is ask Rudy to take this information and actually develop a proposed action plan to work with Mike Jordan at DAS and George Naughton at Budget and Management, so that when he comes back to us, we can actually have a format that shows us what we have been spending, what we might spend, and a series of policy questions that I think gets at both what Hannah raised and you raised about the utility of this for educators and parents and students and the privacy issue. I'd like you to try to do that, push a little hard by our November 11th meeting, because if, in fact, the OEIB recommends that we include some of this in the budget, put the budget to bed by November 16th, so that would give us a chance as a board to make some recommendations on this floor. And I think part of it has to do with how fast we want to ramp this up, and so a strategic plan with next steps and a budget attached to it. Makes sense. Absolutely. Great. Any other final questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. You think that was fun? Let me see the next agenda.
Can't wait.
So, our next item is to get the recommendations from the education funding team. I received these recommendations last week from the education program funding team. David Reeves is on that, along with Pam Curtis, Dan Jameson, Duncan Wise, and Julie Meyer. They spent over 100 hours in June and September stewarding agencies and scrutinizing literally every aspect of it. I want to thank you and all the other members for an incredible commitment of time and energy. The charge was to, with this program funding team as well as the others, which are part of our effort to develop a new 10-year budget, applicable budget process, or at least the budget, at least the budgeting plan rather than planning the budget, as Nancy would say, was to make recommendations to me about the priority for how the state should be investing in education, given the ambitious goals we've set, given the fact that we've got limited resources, what should be sort of the highest priority for investment. And David's going to be presenting the recommendations to the OEIB, and over the next few weeks, we'll be taking a harder look at those. And Rudy set up 8 public forums this next month to get public input on these recommendations. We've got a investment subcommittee. David's chairing that, along with Anna Vandering, Matt Donegan, Dick Alexander, and Nicole. They'll be drilling down on this and we'll be making recommendations to the full OEIB. So what I'd like to do is have David make his presentation. I have Rudy make a couple of comments. And then I want to take, before we open up the full discussion, I want to take a moment and provide a context, because I think it's important to recognize what this is and what this isn't. Because whenever we talk about the budget, it produces a high degree of anxiety. So hopefully we can address that as we go forward.
Thanks, Governor.
We have enough of these to go around. Does everyone have one of these?
The education funding team was charged with recommendations to the governor for a prioritized list of investments in education. It was also encouraged to make recommendations for redesign of funding to fit in better with the PD20 system. Before the education funding team discussed budgets or programs, they looked at what was involved to get to learner-level outcomes set by the OEIB. That's the top pathway there, as you'll recognize from our previous reports in the OEIB. The education funding team looked at what was necessary from the state-level budgeting for the system, for teaching and learning conditions, and for the learner outcomes. So the funding team came up with these 3 paths, and you'll see the other 2 on the bottom, or conditions for teaching and learning and steering the system from the state. I think you'll recognize from previous discussions on this board and from the LearnWorks project too, a lot of these items have been previously talked about. So I hope you recognize some of those there in the way we've set them up in the other 2 pathways there. So I'd like to start with the middle path of what we want to affect, a learner-centered focus with 4 conditions for teaching and learning. The overall focus was for a learner-centered system in line with the OEIB recommendations. And one key part of that learner-centered system is indeed a data system to inform learners and teachers. So we heard a little bit about that previously. But that's also in the recommendations to fit in with that. The first condition for great teaching and learning was supporting educators. And it's important that we do that at all levels, from early learning through university, in ways that are relevant to those types of teaching. Some of the aims there include improving teaching methods and teacher-to-teacher coaching and collaboration. And some of the examples you'd see would be implementing the Common Core curriculum or meeting the completion goals for 40-40-20. A second condition was to support learners and their families with a focus on an early start in learning. And Some of these recommendations were connected with the wraparound services like healthcare, human services. Third condition was to encourage innovation and a system of best practices for organizations to learn what works best for them. And finally, we wanted to ensure that the 0 to 20 continuum supported learners throughout their educational path, with an emphasis on individualized instruction and relevant instruction to help close the achievement gap. So the education funding team consulted with our chief education officer through the process, and he proposed 4 strategic investments that really connected with that middle pathway that I previously mentioned. And I think it really provides a strong focus for state efforts. And these strategic investment proposals are student achievement centers, where educators can collaborate and work on professional development that's relevant to the demands of all levels. And the EFT really found this important because any effort at improving our education system has to really engage our educators and teachers. Another of the strategic investments was Oregon Reads, and this aims to improve reading proficiency in the early years. And we've all discussed on this board how research shows if students aren't proficient in reading by 3rd grade, you're just playing catch-up all the way along the continuum. And so we've made this also a priority in these strategic investments. And a third one was a variety of programs to empower parents and students in the education process. And this would particularly focus on students underrepresented or underserved, like learners of color or English language learners. So we also wanted to make that a priority. And finally, among the strategic investments was treating high school to college as a continuum, with the expectation of a high school degree and college or career paths for all learners. So this really guided us in our recommendations, and I know the Chief Education Officer will be explaining these more in depth after I speak. Next, we came to recommendations to support the learner level outcomes that the OEIB has established. The early learning reorganization into regional hubs was already recommended by a report of the Early Learning Council. In looking at the existing funding streams for all levels in the state budget and trying to get away from the budget silos we currently have, the education funding team looked for ways to align budget priorities with the new priorities of the P20 system. Our recommendations was to establish 4 different funding streams in place of the current silos. And these streams are based on the priorities in the report of the Early Learning Council, and the education funding team felt were more appropriate in the context of the reorganization of early learning. The funding team looked at the funding streams in the K-12 system and came up with some recommendations. One was a reformulation of the English language learner funding, connecting it to an individual learner's proficiency level and the amount of time required to transition to full English proficiency. Another was a reformulation of special education funding into a block fund. It would be at the same level as the maximum that districts currently receive, that is 11% of the student population. The EFT discussed the lack of coordination between high schools, colleges, and universities in funding streams for advanced placement and other early college programs, and recommended that the OEIB look further into these details as we try to coordinate between the sectors there. And a final recommendation was to use some of the current funding for education service district services to set up and run the student achievement centers. In post-secondary education, the education funding team recommended that the state reformulate its funding to include outcomes for college credentials and degrees, including for relevant momentum points like completing a certain amount of credits. In order to close the achievement gap, outcomes for underrepresented and minority students should be weighted more in funding formulas. Finally, there needs to be some kind of stop loss during this transition process to outcome funding, so colleges and universities can transition to the new formula without major funding disruptions. And finally, the education funding team made recommendations into how the state infrastructure could better align its funding for the 0 through 20 system. And categories are up there. They certainly don't reflect everything the state does or should do, but the education funding team thinks these are important drivers in a P through 20 system and really core to the work of a P through 20 system. Recommendations from the funding team suggest that the chief education officer can decide which among these should be our priorities with our current resources as we move ahead. And I think I'll finish up there and let our chief education officer, Dr. Koo, continue with more details on the strategic investments.
Thanks, David. Let me just, at this point, sort of provide a little context for this, because I think it's really important so that we don't get bogged down in period. So if you look at these recommendations, there's really two sets, notwithstanding this last one. The first one are these four strategic investment initiatives. And the second are essentially changing the way existing funds are allocated. So the second one would be taking the resources we have, current resources, more resources, and changing the way we allocate them. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't issues and policy questions there. I know some of you are concerned about the amount of data that's available to actually support linking outcomes to data. So that's something we obviously need to discuss. I'm more concerned about how we approach the first four, because those could theoretically, if we put additional resources into those, compete with the base funding, in particularly the K through 12 system, not exclusively, which I think we all recognize is inadequate already. We're in sort of a cut mode. We're cutting the school year. We're laying people off, and so I think it's real important to provide a context for that. And so what we're not asking the OEIB to do is to recommend how much, if any, new resources should be allocated to these new strategic investment areas. That's ultimately going to be decided by the Ways and Means Committee and by the legislature, with the GRB being the starting point for that. Because at the end of the day, we're not a revenue committee, and we're not a budget committee, we're an investment committee. And our purpose here is to essentially not get bogged down in that debate, but to basically say, regardless of how much money we have, what are the best strategic investments that could most effectively improve outcomes for early learners, could improve on-time high school graduation rate, could improve access to higher education. And what I'm hoping to do is then integrate the recommendations into my budget as a starting point. I recognize that if we don't have priorities, then we're going to basically revert back to the old debate about how much bulk money goes into a given budget, which is, to me, not where we want to end up. If we have a set of investments that this board says these are the 3 or 4 things in this order that would move the dial the most, at the end of the day, the legislature may decide, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to just pump up more money into the base funding. That's okay as long as we're willing to be accountable. Because we've set these 40-40-20 goals, and we have to ask ourselves, how best do we get there? So the setting of priorities gives us a context to have a different kind of education debate next session than we've had before. And I think that's really critical. So I'm hoping that the conversation here can be focused less on how we're going to divide the pie, and we all want to make the pie bigger, but rather what are the priorities of these investments in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So I'll kick it over to Rudy, and we'll just open it up.
Thank you, Governor. Very nice job. Thank you. As you might guess, this has been a very difficult sort of prelude from the last many years, several years, where, as the governor pointed out, budgets have been cut, lots of conversation around how best both to respond to those cuts, but also to be reasonably clear about the focus of institutions and stay true to that mission, where and how collaboration can result in greater efficiencies and the better delivery of programs for students in a P20 system. And along the way, that prelude turned to a current narrative. And the current narrative, as the governor pointed out, is a narrative about what then will be the priorities of this board as we really look into the gaze of a set of outcomes that are 40-40-20 specific. But even more than that, as you look past 40-40-20 and ask the harder question of where is Oregon going to be, where do we want Oregon to be, and how will we actually ensure that the systems in place, early child care systems, the K-12, pre-K-12 systems, the community college and higher education institutions, all as one system, how will we ensure that students have stair steps from where they are now to where ultimately we would like them to be? And so one really important way of thinking about these strategic investments that I've made to both the EFT and subsequently through them to the governor is to essentially say, well, what would it look like if you had more money? What would we do differently? What would we do more of? Maybe what would we even stop doing? That the law now allows us to at least open that and examine that set of questions. A lot of people have had over the course of my brief tenure here, I thought some really interesting conversations about just that answer. All the way from, boy, put a lot of money in early childhood education. Almost universally, wherever I talked, I heard a lot about it. Where I started was, and these are not in particular order, was around the issue of who's going to be teaching our children. How are they prepared? What level of support is given to the professional educator in the state of Oregon? And the first strategic investment specifically goes to address the issue of transforming the way that we onboard, recruit, train, and support both new teachers and veteran teachers. And that we need to do that really with an emphasis at all levels, but particularly with an idea of doing it out in the field as opposed to in specific universities alone or in school districts alone, but rather in a consortium or in a collaboration with multiple agencies and institutions who have responsibility for the support of the professional teacher in this state. Now, let me just say one last word about this. I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but enough to say this country has gone, in my judgment, slightly awry on the question of how do we prepare and support teachers. I've had a lot of conversations with people as to what it might look like differently, and there are some agencies already in this state that I think are doing a really superb job of crystallizing what that vision could and should look like. But I think to a large degree, we've got to start there and focus on that by the development of or the investment of 4 to 6 regional centers who have a really intense focus on promoting excellence among the teaching profession and celebrating that. I also think parenthetically that we've got to find a way of being able to blend, or if you will, merge the professional teacher in a pre-K-12 system with what happens in a community college system and what happens in a higher ed system. That these aren't distinct bodies of intelligence, that these are actually crossover places where we actually could and should share some of the intellectual wealth that's available in our community colleges and in our higher education institutions. With respect to the second strategic objective, this is specific to the question of, well, then what content area should we really start and focus on if we want to be sure that we aren't necessarily always looking at putting dollars into remediation? If this were a business, I would say to you, our burn rate is a function of the fact that we have far too many young people who finish with a grade level and they are not functional readers. And we keep chasing them through each successive year, trying to make them a better reader. And we never, ever either have enough money or nor do we ever catch up. And so we have got to double down on this question of Oregon reading. I'll say no more about that for now, but suffice to say that it does involve a primary focus, obviously, in literacy instruction, family literacy, real focus on ELL, and real focus on parents actually and the role that they will play in helping students to build, both at home and in school, a rich and extensive use of language in all genres. That they actually get an opportunity to read, to write, to think critically, and to use their skills so that they actually see reading as both joy, but equally as important as a tool for being able to go do exactly what they want to do post-secondary and in the world of work. The third strategic objective really had to do with a complement to what I just said about supporting families vis-a-vis reading, but this is really about supporting and building and strengthening student and families and the relationship with schools. I don't want to go through a lot of conversation about this, but suffice to say that this really has to do with leveraging the community and parents and the notion of culture as a value proposition in having children actually see that what they have already, what they bring to the table already, really represents the first sign of their brilliance. That they come into our schools capable of thinking about and being exceptional. And that is a function of their culture, their language, and their home. And we've got to actually start to figure out how to harness that so that we go from just the conversation about content, or just the conversation about strategies, or even just the conversation about assessment. We move from that, and the banality of that, to be perfectly honest with you, to the richness of, now how does culture inform content? How would culture inform assessment? And how would culture inform the strategies that we use in the teaching of our children at a high level? That involves families. That involves every single kind of family that we have in this great state. The fourth is about the connective tissue between the skills that we know students actually need for not only being able to take and complete course and program elements, but what are those skills that they need to actually become very capable students in the global context? How do they actually understand the rules of the road as it relates to them going directly into the world of work? So when a student actually does finish one of our community colleges, and when they actually walk out the door with certification or with a diploma, and that second 40 is actually actualized, then the question becomes, well, now what do you do? How do you take that and network yourself into your first job? How do you do that if you've come from various kinds of communities here in this state and you've not had a lot of networking already? So the idea here behind some of this is that we actually need to really think about the proposition that this is not just about getting a better test score. It's not necessarily even just about getting access into, and yet importantly, getting into a post-secondary institution. It's about the world after that. The fact that you get a seat at the global table by virtue of how you actually have learned and have been exposed to a set of skills that are provided for you in new and different models, from community colleges to other four-year institutions. Those, Governor and Board, represent the way that I've sort of situated this conversation as to the stair steps that would be necessary for us to think about getting all students to a 40-40-20 goal and beyond. Should there be additional consideration financially, both in the legislature and here, for that? Thank you.
Good. David, you have to say a few comments, and then we'll open it up.
There's just a typo I want to mention before we start the discussion. On page 4 of the report, in the outcomes for strategic investment 1, it should say increase the number of education professionals, PK through 12, who are non-white or Hispanic, and as native languages, not English, by 10%. It should be non-white or Hispanic. That's a typo.
Okay. Who wants to start? And again, we're gonna also have our investment subcommittee spend some time sort of boring into this as well, and we can see if there's some instruction we want to give.
So overall, I really like this. I really appreciate the student focus. I appreciate the specifics. I couldn't be more pleased with it. I have one small suggested change, which is to not just include evidence-based practice, but also to include practice-based evidence. There are many examples, particularly in the Native American community, where evidence-based practices have not been researched and actually have been shown to do harm on those communities. I believe the same is true for some of our rural communities and other communities of color or traditionally underserved students. And so, while I know there are many strengths with evidence-based practice, there's also another scientifically valid option that I think we should consider so we can have the best impact.
I would just agree that evidence-based practices sometimes become barriers for ELLs just because there's not enough research out there in those areas, so.
Term that's often used as emerging practices.
Grab the mic there.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
What I was saying is that a term that's often used now as emerging practices, but with evaluation.
I would also support that. I think there's a growing body of knowledge about the emergence of practice. I'd also like to shift topics, and I just want to raise a question in terms of what's on page 11, starting on page 11, and after we call them dots rather than bullets. There's a line there about extra weighting for underserved students, and I want to applaud that. I want to go to the next line, though, that says formula design should reflect the distinct missions of community colleges and universities. And I know we've discussed this several times, but I'd like to just emphasize that there are some shifting sands here, and we have we talk about this a lot. We've asked community colleges to take some of them as many as 20 to 25% of our students who've gone through high school and received high school diplomas or equivalent and are not ready to do post-secondary work. And as we begin to reflect on the mission, I would like us to keep in mind that we are, first of all, shifting in terms of some of the missions, and second, that the community colleges and universities have historically had a mission of access that has been a great mission of access, and I want us to be careful about that, making sure we don't lose that even as we shift. And there's a lot of passion around the mission of community colleges to provide access, and I certainly wouldn't like anyone to think that we intend to do differently.
Gary?
Well, just to build on what Sam was saying, on the issue of outcomes or performance-based funding, I hope as we go into this conversation, we're going to look at the research that has already been done. There's a lot of experience across the country in community colleges, and I'm speaking specifically about community colleges, about outcomes or performance-based funding. And the research shows that there's little or no impact on student learning outcomes. And there's quite a bit of that out there. So I think we need to consider the experience of other states as we're having this conversation. Another thing that we find is the unintended consequences of limiting the mission, specifically what we were talking about, and cutting out when you see outcomes like degrees and certificates, which of course we need to work on and do better at. But one easy way to get there is to say, well, we'll take better prepared students. And I think we need to be really thoughtful about the consequences of that, because the very reason community colleges are set up is to serve those students. And I think this board has a strong commitment to equity and making sure the door is still open for all to get into higher education. So I'm happy to participate in this discussion, but I'm not ready to move until we know that we're basing it on a good academic process, which is research, and we learn from that and we discuss it and reach conclusions.
Just two items. On page 6, looking at strategic investment number 3, I think this is a great opportunity for us maybe to call out cross-sector proposals or reaching across into other entities in the state budget, such as DHS. You know, we've had some great conversations recently with Aaron and Kelly Seal at DHS on wraparound possibilities, and I see wraparound as called out, but I would just maybe throw a suggestion that could be strengthened. This could be a real opportunity for us, maybe a little bit of, changing the game, changing the conversation, because I love number 3, supporting students and families, but it's not just education, supporting families, and this is a great opportunity for us. The second component, and I know this has been thought of, but as I'm just looking through the outcomes, I'm pleased to see specific outcomes in each one of these strategies, but there isn't necessarily alignment to the achievement compact. So I know, down the line, the idea that as I look at these various outcomes and I think about the evolution of the achievement compacts, maybe we keep those together, that they're aligned, we're moving in a direction to align within those same investments, that's what we're going to measure. I mean, I'm thinking as a superintendent, it would be very nice to say, okay, third grade literacy, that's the major one, there's going to be an investment of $1, and here's the outcome in the achievement compact for third grade literacy, which is there now, but it's not called out as much as maybe we would have a chance to do within this.
And just in response to the 2 previous remarks from Sam and Mary about post-secondary, part of the constraints of the team is we were really looking in the focus of 40-40-20. And I think that one line about the distinct missions of community colleges and universities, part of our discussion, I don't think it makes it into this report very clearly, but is that there are more to the missions of community colleges and universities than just 40-40-20 and granting degrees, particularly with the community colleges, community or public service and workforce development, and particularly with and lifelong learning too, and particularly with the universities, community or public service and research. And we wanted to make, that was the constraints we were working under, but I think it should be clear to this board and everybody discussing education in the state that those also have to be prioritized within the framework of what we look at as post-secondary education.
So at our last meeting, what we were given by the funding team was the whole list of expenditures. And we were told they were going to bring back a prioritized list. So I was a little surprised the way this went. And I also know that we've talked a lot about tight-loose. And as I was reading this, I was going back to Oregon Learns, which is the first document that came from the OEIT, the team, and the budget committee. And it really, honestly wasn't vetted through that team very well before it went out. But that's the document that we took out the last time to Oregonians. And we asked them to tell us what they thought about Oregon Learns. I think there's a lot of similarities in this document as to what was in the last document. Pointing out special education, pointing out ELL funding. I appreciate, and I think that Oregonians told us, they focus on early learning. The reading is a great component. But what they told us was class size matters to Oregonians. There's nothing in here to address class size. They told us that career and technical opportunities for our students mattered to them. There's not a whole lot around that in this document. Some of the language that also came out around the hubs, that was kind of dismissed during the last set of forms that we had around the state. There's a lot of language in here that goes to the tight about here's what we expect you to do and here's how you're going to do it. And I would hope that while we need to make movement, while we need to change the dynamics and do what's right for every student in this state, I think we're getting a little ahead again by saying we've just got a waiver from No Child Left Behind. We no longer have those constraints around us, and educators can now, through the compacts, create an avenue to make a difference for kids, but yet we're pulling in really tight around them. And right now, I'm not sure how many of you have been in our schools since school started. Class size is absolutely out of control. We're talking over 50 students in high school classrooms. Elementary, when I talk to my colleagues and they say, my kindergarten class is 26, my reaction is, whoa, that's pretty good. And that is so wrong for what our students need. We're talking about class size that is appropriate for kindergarten, between 15 and 20, and we're at 30 plus in many of our districts across the state. So I know that we don't have a larger pie of money that we're going to be able to tap into right now. And I appreciate, Governor, your wanting to keep us on track about what we have. But I think we need to be really careful as we move forward with the work that we do to keep in mind the realities in our classrooms right now and how we engage not only the educators, but parents in this conversation, because they're angry about the class size as well. And make sure that they are in this with us. Because right now, as I listen to people talk about the work we're doing, they're not very impressed. They're angry about several things that we've done. And we need to just hear that and make sure that we discuss it in an open, honest way and do the work that we need to do to help our P through 20 system grow. So I look forward to hearing what Oregonians have to say about this, and I hope that we are willing to listen and make adjustments accordingly to what they want and need.
And I would certainly endorse that, but I also think that if the board wants to recommend that the first thing we do is reduce class size and have a longer school year, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's essentially the debate we've been having for 20 years. I mean, it's not a qualitative debate, it's an important debate. And it's a legitimate debate. And I think the thing that people get really upset about, and I've been to school quite a few times so far this year, back to school night, for example. People are very upset about the class sizes. And that really is a function of getting more resources into the overall macro budget. But it just seems to me at some point, in addition to that, we've got to have a more focused discussion. I mean, if we reduce class size and didn't really intentionally try to reduce the achievement gap on the front end, or intentionally try to increase the number of college credits kids have before they graduate from high school, I'm not sure we would get what we wanted to get. So I don't think these are mutually exclusive. And Hannah's right. The reason I made my remarks on the front end is the whole system is woefully on the front end. And the intention here is not to dismiss that lightly. It's to try to create a more robust framework for having the budget debate that we're going to be having here in the next 6 months.
I was just going to add some little pieces, so I'm trying to figure out if it's value added. I'll go ahead and mention it. On page 5, reading intervention and support programs, I want to continue. First of all, I want to say I'm really glad to see that ELL is a called out strategy, and the issues we need to, the strategies we need to identify for ELL students. But I just wanted to call it an example. For example, when you talk about RTI and moving forward with, for example, the idea of research-based, RTI is research-based and it's great and identifies those needs, but we need to layer over that the issues for culturally and linguistically diverse students, and the research base isn't as robust there yet. And it's the achievement, so there's a few pieces that I just wanted to call as examples. So in the Achievement Compact, we talk about reading in 3rd grade. And then farther down in this document, it talks about evidence-based, culturally appropriate programs. So to use an example, bilingual education or dual language programs. Having the goal of reading in English at 3rd grade in those particular programs could disadvantage the way that approach was in that program. I'm not sure if I'm being clear. So all I wanted to call out is that even though we call out these specific areas to focus, we need to pay attention to the layering on of the issues that cross over several of them, and that's just one I would give an example to, but I think another one would be some of the solutions we might think about around serving students with special education needs, that we have to kind of look at in cross ways, any of those strategies that we would look at to ensure that we're not just going kind of like a bull through some of these ideas saying this is the research-based strategy without looking at the impact on these different groups of students.
Well, Dr. Schmidt, I'd like to say I am really pleased and encouraged by your strategic investment #1, because I do believe that part of the answer to the large questions is supporting teachers to be innovative and creative, and I think they become innovative and creative if we do have a higher investment in the kind of support for professional education. So I think this is critical, and I think it's key, and I think it's going to be one of the strategies that leads to some of the issues that you just identified.
Just one final comment. I guess what I see in here are things we have talked about, areas and leverage points we have talked about for about a year, that we keep coming back to. We know pre-K/3rd grade reading is critical. We know 11 to 14 and blurring the lines between the junior year in high school and sophomore year of college is a key leverage point. That's it. We know engaging families and communities is critical. That's in here. We know we need more kids getting to the finish line that are globally competitive and ready to enter the workforce. That's in here. So I think that what we have heard consistently about the impact of poverty, too much testing, NCOB jail, all those kinds of things, what I see in here are the key things that we keep driving back to for the passion.
I'm just wondering about the process. Obviously, this is across the state to be discussed, and we're going to hear from Oregonians. You've got a deadline for your budget of somewhere mid-November, December 1st to publish it. So what's the process? How do we engage with these conversations other than being in forums? How do we process everything that we're hearing? Is it going to a subcommittee of this board? Or?
So we have an investment subcommittee, and they're going to be looking at this, and we'll make available to them all the folks they need from DAS and from BAM, and then we'll be having the community meetings that Rudy is in charge of. And the idea is from the gleaning of the information from the community meetings and the recommendation of the subcommittee, we formulate a recommendation from this board to the budget process, and I'll try to incorporate that in the budget document.
I mean, I would just say that redoing funding formulas is no small task, having been involved in community college ones that take a fairly long, in-depth period of time to juggle all the variables, and I just feel like it's on a very, very tight time.
Well, it is, and partly because we're attempting to change the budget process, start the sort of the new 10-year budget process in this next biennium, and I think from the standpoint of the project program funding teams, it was a pretty short time frame, and obviously I think we need to recognize that this is a first cut at something, that it's not going to be perfect, and we have short time frames, but I would say that we can be more intentional than not not even taking a cut at it. But I think if we can learn, if we're willing to be flexible and learn from what works and what doesn't work in this budget process, we'll be in a much better position to have a template for the next biennium and beyond.
Just hope it's not literally going to be the first time.
Yes.
Governor, to
Oh, medical term.
Yes.
Sorry. And then we'll suture it all back together.
I just want to note that on the formula, the proposed formula changes, really they're proposals for design work to drill down more specifically on the formula changes for K-12 post-secondary learning. Each of those formulas, at least in the K-12 and post-secondary space, would not necessarily need to be reflected in the governor's budget itself. That's the question of how resources that the legislature allocates are in turn distributed to institutions, K-12 districts, and colleges and universities. So there are various boards in the K-12 case, the legislature, through statute, that provides those for it. So I think that there's actually a slightly different timeline, a little bit more. I think the urgency is great, and the governor's budget may want to allude to that ongoing work, but it doesn't necessarily need to be incorporated right away.
Did the funding team have any data from other states that did special ed block funding? Did you guys look at anything?
I don't recall that.
So is there any
I'm
research
looking
out
at
there?
other state formulas for that. I don't recall it specifically.
And I don't know if this is possible with the staff, but as we're going out and doing the forms, is there any way to crosswalk the input that we get with this actual document so we could see what the feedback is around the different areas that are incorporated into this proposal?
Could you say that again?
So we're going out, we're going to be giving a presentation, there's going to be a presentation given around this, I believe. And then can we take the input that we're getting from those who attend and crosswalk through this document so we see, so that this board could have that information that would help us in determining what they think about the particular areas embedded in this.
I don't see what, what's the time frame for this? When will the last meeting be?
The webinar on the
public
30th.
meeting.
The last meeting is on October 30th, and the plan is to bring back to the board at the November 9th meeting a summary of the comments that we received at the meetings, as well as.
So if it's possible to organize those in a way that we can sort of crosswalk them through this document, that'd be really useful.
That's
This document will serve as the basis of the presentation, so we will be sharing this information.
Any other comments? David, thank you very much. We now have some invited public testimony from Salem Kaiser School District. Well, thank you for letting us use your school.
Well, the welcome goes to you. Governor, Dr. Crew, members of the OEIB, we want to welcome you to the Salem Kaiser School District, and particularly to McKay High School. I do a few introductory remarks, and then Principal Ken Parshall is going to say a few things. We have a couple quick comments from a teacher and a student. In the Salem Kaiser School District, I like to picture it this way. Every day we have 40,000 fantastic, enthusiastic, talented, ready to learn, backpacks, homework's in it, smiling, standing in line, ready to come to school. They're all well behaved. It's a vision. 65% of them happen to qualify for free and reduced lunch. That means 26,000 students. That would fill every single seat we have in 43 elementaries and 6 middle schools. 40% of them are minority, mostly Hispanic. 25%, that's a full 10,000 students, hear a language other than English in the evening. That would fill every single seat we have in our 6 comprehensive high schools. And yet we believe we're beating the odds. Our graduation rate is on an incline. We're up 7 percentile points over the last 4 years. We're now at 70%. Our dropout rate is down. It's down 7 percent points. It's under 4%. It's down from 7% dropout to under 4%. In closing the gap on our graduation rate, remember I said it's up 7% points, our Hispanic is up 12% points, our poverty students are up 11%, and our ELL is up 8%. Reading and math scores are up, and we need to do a lot more work on writing. So while we're celebrating the successes, we still have a long way to go to get to 40-40-20. The question is, how and why are we getting these results in this school district? We believe it's because we have a relentless focus on student achievement. We focus on results. We have a robust data warehouse. We use it. We have a good formative assessment program. We believe leadership really matters, from our Board of Education, our leadership team, our teacher leaders, our community leaders. We align our beliefs and expectations. We have a no-excuse attitude. We focus on staff quality. We really believe in treating professionals like professionals, pushing decision-making down into the organization, community engagement, and involving all stakeholders. You're sitting in a high school today that used to be called persistently dangerous. I loved it that you were here through 2 passing periods, and I hope you felt really safe. You're sitting in a high school that used to be labeled failing, and yet this is a high school that is an exemplar. McKay High School is an exemplar for the state and for the nation. In the past 5 years, Hispanic reading proficiency has tripled from 26 to 75%. Hispanic student math proficiency has doubled, more than doubled, from 24 to 67%. All McKay students' reading has gone up from 43 to 77%. And math for McKay students has gone up from 36 to 71%. The dropout rate has plummeted from 6% down to 1.4%. This is a high school of 2,000 students, about 80% poverty, 70% minority, and almost half of the kids hear a language other than English. I wished you could have been here earlier in the day to poke your head in some of the classrooms, and we would invite you back at any time to come and see the great work that's being done here. I attribute it to Ken and his team. I'm going to let the teacher and student come up, and he'll give you a few words about how the school is doing.
Thank you, Dr. Husk. Governor Kitzhaber, Dr. Crew, and members of the board. I'm joined by an outstanding teacher at McKay High School, Miss Lisa Shreve, and one of our fine students, a senior student, Salvador Garibay. I'd like to just briefly describe what we've done at McKay High School to improve student achievement, who has done the work, and how we've done that work. First of all, I'd like to say that teachers have worked to get together to identify key curriculum that they're going to guarantee that all their students will learn. They've worked together in collaborative teams to develop common units of study in every course at McKay High School. We've invested in professional development on a weekly basis. Our teachers train, much like an athlete or a musician trains to improve. Our teachers train every Tuesday morning to improve instruction. Our teachers collaborate. They work in teams. They develop common units of study with common assessments, with common calendars, and common intervention days where they've agreed to reteach what kids don't learn. We've also developed and implemented an extensive system of student supports. So when kids can't read, write, and do math at the highest level that's required for college entrance, we give them additional time and support in those areas with research-based instructional strategies. We hosted an Avid open house today, which is one of our partners that helps us lift kids up in the middle who might not otherwise be able to navigate that path to college. And the theme that came from the comments from our guests, principals, counselors, teachers who visited McKay classrooms from other schools today was the level of engagement of our students. I didn't know what to expect for a theme, but I'm really proud of that theme that came back. They said when they walked in classrooms, they said, there's not a kid with their head down in the back. There's not some of the kids doing the work and some not doing the work. All of your kids are engaged. And that was great feedback for us, encouraging feedback, because that's due to the instruction that our teachers provide in each classroom. And so instruction is the place that will help improve student achievement. Thank you for being our guest today. We're really proud of the improvement that we've had, and we look forward because our best improvement is yet to come. As we all know, we can look at our banked passing scores on those essential skills, and we know what's coming. And I can't wait to share the results that are coming in our student achievement results this year. Lisa Shreve is a French teacher, a leadership teacher, and an avid elective teacher.
Yes.
And a real leader on our teaching staff. And I've asked her to join us and just comment a little bit about the role of teacher because she's been here over a number of years.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm the activities director here in the building, and also I'm one of the directors of our Link Crew program, which is a transition for 8th to 9th grade. Huge influence in the building and in terms of school culture and the experience that our kids have here. Been at McKay for 10 years, 10 plus years. And so have been part of the demographic shift that's occurred that I believe is kind of the harbinger of what's going to be is happening statewide and in our district as well. And wanted to speak to a couple things that Mr. Parshall referred to with regard to how we've been using our resources and focusing on kids. And part of that is the reading, writing, and math workshops that we've had our students do. As someone who initially was skeptical about that for kids, it didn't take very long for me to see that the results that our kids experience in those classrooms, particularly students who are learning English as a second or third language, that their experience is directly transferred into each of their content area classes. And all of the teachers here, I believe, have seen those results. Not surprising, but have seen the skill level of our kids increase exponentially, really. Dr. Huss shared the results, our test scores with the kids, but it goes way beyond test scores. And I'd be the first person to say that to anyone. It always goes beyond test scores. Even though what we're doing for kids is helping them to graduate because they need that test score, the skills and the things that they're doing in those classes and how that carries over into our content area classes is huge. So I want to speak to that. The other thing is a collaborative piece for teachers. It is not an option in this school to close your door and do whatever you want to do. And I love that. And we have developed a staff in the building of teachers who also love that. And the fact that we have the time built into our school day and have had the training and the scaffolding to be able to work in functioning collaborative teams. And I want to be clear about that. They're functioning collaborative teams. They're not dysfunctional. And it's not because we have to do it. It's because it's the right thing to do for kids, to form common unit plans, common formative assessments, summative assessments, proficiency-based grading. All of those conversations are happening at a really high level in this building as a result of the resources we've been allocated and the training that we've been provided and that we consistently do every week. So Tuesdays and Thursday mornings for an hour, 2 hours a week, we are training. It's not just about in-service days or the work that we did in our graduate programs. And that's made a huge, huge difference for us. And as an avid teacher, seeing those strategies present in all classrooms, Socratic seminars, interactive notebooks, Cornell notes, it's all about good instruction. And we're just able to focus that a little bit more in a program that is flourishing in our building right now, our AVID program, and as an elective teacher for our 9th grade students, I'm proud to be representing that right now. So thank you for your time.
And we've asked Salvador to join us because he's a senior. And so he's seen our school improve over the last few years. And so without too much preparation, we've said, Salvador, just tell him what it's been like to be here over the last 4 years. So.
Thank you, Mr. Parshall. I'm Sal Gerbe. I'm a senior here, and I'm just a usual student who from freshman year to senior year have felt and lived through the changes the administration has given us, and they've done the best that they could get. Our teachers have not only befriended us, they've been with us after school, before school. They're there for to work with us and to be there for us because they know that to succeed here is the best way that get as a high school education. With the increased amount of adult presence in our school, our students, including myself, had not felt any intimidation by them. They're there for you. They're there for you to succeed because they want you to succeed. And by that, we come to class on time. When that bell rings, where there's 2 minutes left in the hallway for the next class, they push us and to run pretty much to our class. So we are there to learn. We are here to succeed, and that makes them come back here. That makes us students return the next day to make ourselves feel much better about ourselves, because we're not here just to learn core classes and test scores that are improving tremendously. We're here to better our lives, to better ourselves as students and as teachers. So I thank our administration and the adults around us a lot, because they're making me who I am and helping me in the future because of that. Yeah, so I thank you for letting me share from the student side.
Well, thank you very much.
Governor, could I ask a question? Salvador, what's next for you? What are you doing next?
What am I doing next? After high school or after
Yeah.
Not today.
Boy, I forgot how loaded the question. Yes, after high school.
After high school, I do plan to go to university. Even though I am undecided on what to do, I'm leaning towards different subjects for now. Berkeley, the choice, is my personal goal to achieve, and go from there.
Thank you. Nancy?
Yeah, Mark.
I heard 2 hours of PLC time a week.
Mm-hmm.
7 period day? How do you carve that out in 7 period day?
So one of the things that we've done that's unique at McKay High School is we have chosen not to do a late start or early dismissal, because our staff, as we worked together, we decided that teacher-student time together was so sacred, and the level of improvement that we needed to achieve, we decided to do our professional development in the morning before the student day starts. On Tuesdays, we do our professional development. On Thursdays, we have our collaborative teacher teams. And so it's about 50 minutes on Tuesday morning and about 50 minutes on Thursday morning. Our staff have worked extremely hard. I'm so proud of them. We have the best staff in the world. They've worked very hard. The achievement that we've achieved has been strongly due to the work ethic and commitment of our teachers to helping our students learn at a higher level.
Yeah.
Do you have a specific strategy that you employ to address growing class sizes? And if so, what impact have you seen from it?
Right. Certainly, class size is a factor, but we believe in instruction is the key. So today when we had visitors talk about our level of engagement for our students, the key that I pointed them to was that's about the instructional strategies our teachers are using. So the instructional strategies that our teachers embrace at McKay High School engage all the students in the room, whether there's 20 or whether there's 38 or whether there's 42. We know that instructional strategy is the key to success and increasing learning. Certainly there's, as class size grows, the biggest problem is giving feedback to students, especially on their writing, because we try to have students write every day in every class. And we know that to improve writing, you must provide not just practice at writing, but provide feedback. So class size hinders the ability to give quality feedback to kids. We are working with colleges and universities to add to the adults in the room. We have college students right now serving their practicum time as additional adults inside classrooms in order to provide more feedback to students regarding their writing. Yeah. Thanks a lot for having us, and we appreciate you being our guest.
Question?
Yeah.
Maybe this is less one of the answers maybe it's for ask about the amount of money on achievement compact, what the summary money was. I know that Salem doesn't have a local option, so it sounds like some incredible things happen, and just looking at it from a statewide perspective, the amount of resources you have, looking at other districts that have a similar number of students and outcomes, how are you most effectively using your limited resources?
So when we started, thank you, when we started the change initiatives at the district level, we were on an upswing in the state. So we were able to invest from general fund into the professional development and some of the infrastructures like the data warehouse, the formative assessment system. We would be challenged to do that today under the existing state funding situation. But because we already had those investments there, the momentum was able to start. Some of the specific interventions that have been extremely helpful at this building have come through support of the school improvement grant money. And we believe that we will continue to get better when those funds are gone, but the potential to soar is certainly more viable when you have that level of financial support. So we really think focusing our time and our energy and our passion is most critical, but resource alignment, in addition to that, also is essential.
What's the number on your achievement compact, the local money,
I don't have it memorized, and I don't have the people here that would, but I will send it to you by email.
Okay, yeah, I'm just curious, because I was looking at some comparative, you see some very different outcomes from districts that have a lot more money. So what are the strategies of districts that have less resources? Just making an assumption out of the say, how are they using that to achieve?
I know it's less than, say, Portland Public, who has a significant local option. I just don't know exactly what the dollars were for me to quote it in this kind of a setting.
Other questions? Yeah, Anna.
So you have SIG money for McKay.
Yes.
And was it in any priority school as well? Have they been, I know they were.
We have 4 priority schools in Salem-Kaiser: Hallman Elementary, Roberts High School, and Early College High School, and McKay High School.
Okay, so that they're getting, Julia, to that question, you're getting money for that to be able to use?
We're getting about $5.7 million over a 3-year period specific to this building. But I do want to say, I'm not trying to minimize the amount of dollar resources, but the energy and the purchases that we did before this started really laid the groundwork. And so I think they're both critical, and I know that the principals get anxious when they're in these high needs, high impacted neighborhoods, that when that resource is pulled away, will there be a tremendous backslide? I don't believe there will be, but I think the potential for soaring is much stronger when we know that we've got the ability to resource it in the fashion that it needs to be.
And I know Mr. Partial is not going
Yeah. I think they went to college together.
Yeah. Many moons ago.
Yeah.
Other comments, questions? Thank you for your incredible work.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We're going to take a 10-minute break, so we'll see you back here at about 3:25. Okay. So on your agenda now, we're at updates and staff reports, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Crew.
The first item, members of the board, deals with the 2012-13 achievement compacts, and I'm going to ask Margie if you come up. But let me just say as an introduction to this that we have had, as you well know, a number of really good conversations all around the state with people who are engaged in or have already completed, at least in the K-12 portion of the school, their achievement compacts. Margie was talking a little bit about that. There's obviously been a number of comments relative to wanting to make changes as we go forward. I would point out to the board that the intent here is to both hear and to respond to those, not today, but to respond to their queries as to how this will look going forward, make the necessary changes. But ultimately to do this with an eye toward sending this ultimately from this report, sending it directly to Best Practices Committee and have them have a good hard look at ways by which we might ultimately improve this even more. So be aware that the follow-up here is to get this in the hands of the subcommittee, and then we'll bring it back to finalization.
So thank you, Dr. Crew, and members of the OEIB. I need longer arms. The achievement compacts for K-12 required a lot of time for analysis because it was a very new process, and districts submitted them over a period of time into different degrees of completeness. But we got to a point where we had all of them in hand and at least certain components of them available for analysis. Dr. Crew asked me to look at initially 3 components of the compacts for K-12 that included 3rd grade reading, 3rd grade math, and 9th grade students on track to graduation for all students. So it gave us a specific focus for consideration. After considerable review and discussion amongst all of us policy types, we felt that because of the newness of the 9th grade on track measure, some of the districts had not even been able to propose targets in this area. Others, most in fact, had not developed any historical information about what their previous student progress had been in this area. And because of that, a decision was made to use instead either 4-year or 5-year high school completion, or rather graduation data for that initial review. And we chose both because different high schools have varying policies around encouraging students to stay for a 5th year because they do more direct involvement with post-secondary education in some of their partnership programs. So looking at each of those and to look at, did the district in their compact propose 1% or greater improvement over the last pre-filled validated data point that had been sent to them in the initial compact. In looking at across the spectrum for those 3 measures, so we basically said we're going to put aside at the moment the 9th grade on track and instead look at the graduation information. 101 districts met that threshold of 1% or greater improvement. Although, as you recall, when I shared the information at the OEIB board meeting a couple of meetings ago, we had some districts who had proposed really extraordinary improvement that seemed to be beyond the achievable, ambitious yet achievable goal-setting process that had really been emphasized throughout the Achievement Compact development process. So we in fact sent some districts a request for revision because the view was that because of the extraordinary level of their target, they probably were beyond that achievable boundary in the first year. So 101 districts received an acceptance letter, and another 25 districts received a letter saying that their compacts were being accepted, but that was because we did not receive any data for their particular students because those districts are so small that there was not any data that was included in the pre-filled cell on the compact. And 70 districts received a letter from Dr. Crew asking that they please go back and look at the targets for those 3 measures, and if they had not increased it by 1% within those boundaries, could they reconsider their compact in those measures and resubmit that with a brief rationale for what their strategies will be for improving student performance. in those 3 categories. As of today, as of the middle of this meeting, 9 of those 70 districts have already resubmitted revised targets that are within that scope, along with a brief summary of their strategy. And so I've had a lot of discussion with many districts across the state. They are very engaged in the conversation and very supportive of Dr. Crew's focus. And I think by October 15th, we're going to be in really good shape. So I'd be glad to answer any other questions. Oh, then on next steps, meanwhile, I'm hearing from a lot of districts and other education entities looking for guidance for what we're going to be doing next on achievement compacts for the coming year. And along with that, the board has received comment from 4 different organizations. I think 3 of them are in your packet, and, or, no, 5 different organizations, 3 of which are in your packet. No, 4 are in your packet, and 1 is a late arrival from the Oregon Community College Association. And so in talking with Dr. Crew and with the Chief of Staff, we hope that you have time to consider those suggestions, and that would be subject for more considerable discussion at the November meeting, with the hope that we would be able to post advice to all of the education entities in early December to help guide their development processes for the coming year. I'd be glad to answer any other questions.
Questions, Mark, and then Hannah.
As part of our best practices subcommittee, several of us will be working on the achievement compacts with Margie. And I was just wondering what we're thinking in the way of timeline. I mean, we're receiving a lot of input, gone through the first process, we're getting revisions. Just curious on what the thoughts are in the upcoming months for our plan to get together and move forward with the evolution of the achievement compact.
Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that this would be a topic that would go to your committee with the expectation that the committee would delve deeper into some of the critical questions that are part of this entire conversation. And I think those critical questions will both be K-12 specific, but I think they'll also be community college specific, which means that the next meeting is when I would expect to then have a community college conversation, if you will, relative to exactly or at least a debrief relative to the contacts at that level. Both of those bodies, the K-12 and the community college body of work, will go to your committee to delve deeper, as I said, into the questions of the day, some of the issues, make appropriate recommendations back to OEIB in enough time to influence, and I haven't specified a date yet, Mark, but in enough time to influence the way that this actually begins the process for next year. So my hope is that it's prior to right at the close of the first semester kind of thing, or at least even a little bit beyond the first semester, if we find ourselves needing a bit more time. The idea being that you would then use that input, bring back the recommendations, then actually post the new, if you will, context going forward. So there should be ample time for the board to hear and consider all, not only the letters that have been submitted, but other inquiries that have been made relative to the achievement compact process. Very helpful.
Other questions? Yeah, Hannah.
Margie, I'm wondering if there was any questions from superintendents or school boards around the direction that we headed with the letters, because there was a document that was sent in asking some very specific questions from COSA around the compacts. And the question was, does the OEIB have the authority to reject a district achievement compact or an advisory committee report? And the answer that they received back from us was, the OEIB will not reject an achievement compact if the district completes its compact in full. And then it goes on to say the chief education officer acting on behalf of the OEIB must acknowledge receipt of the compact and will notify districts of the board's acceptance of the local priorities to be included. So process is really important, and our timeline was so short that, well, again, we know that we need to be moving the dial, but if we told them we would not reject them, were there questions about why then they got letters speaking to whether they were accepted or not?
I think the view is that we have not rejected any compact. What we've done is asked districts to go back and focus on just 3 specific measures for all students to develop strategies that would help them be more successful in those very specific areas. And I know that Dr. Crew hopes in the future to move that focus not so much from the graduation, but instead to the 9th grade on track, because those measures are so critical to students having sufficient time to really change their trajectory towards success while they're in school. And we've not refused or rejected anything. We've simply asked districts to work with us to help identify more effective ways to help improve those student outcomes.
But we said the initial acceptance in the letter that went out. So it was, I know that Dr. Crew wasn't here when we had these conversations. And so I'm just wondering about what conversations had happened about the document that was shared with administrators I believe that Tim Nesbitt had, and I'm not sure who all they worked with.
I can just shed some light as to the way that I've placed this into context. You're right, new person in the board. The stipulation of the document being completed in full, to me, includes the ability to have made a thoughtful, rational reflection of what the outcomes might be in terms of gains or growth or productivity. So in full, to me, meant satisfying the fullness of an expectation that could rightly be communicated to a staff, school, district, etc. And there were some that simply were not in full in my book.
And I would say in my conversations with superintendents and a number of their staff, I have not had districts pushing back about not being willing to look at these particular measures. I think they've appreciated having a more specific focus from Dr. Crew to help guide their local decisions. And they've been very responsive, and I think it's indicative of the success that we already have. So many already have been returned.
Yvonne, I just wanted to add that just some anecdotal things I've heard from my peers in terms of, especially from really small school districts, is that when we focus on things as a system, it helps, and I've been in some of those small school districts, so just even looking at 9th grade on track, and that some districts just simply haven't had the means or whatever to collect that information, the idea that we can learn from one another and that there might be help from the state and that we might be doing this as a statewide system, I think is helpful. So I'm just going to say that I think that part of the view of many of the superintendents, won't speak for all of them, but some that I've had conversations with, is that we know that this is a work in progress and that what we're keeping our eye on is the end goal. And I think that whatever we can do together and help one another to inform the process and how we might help, how one district sets those goals. For example, we had a lot of questions around what methodology we use for setting the goals, and even when we all sort of agreed maybe we might use the same methodology, there were some differences because of the local challenges or different views within the district. So I think it's more of how you view the whole process of a work in progress and how we can learn from one another, and what having those measures might allow us to, or at least the idea that we want to collect the data in some way that's uniform across the state is actually a very welcomed conversation to many of us.
Another thing that we've shared with districts, particularly with very small districts, is that they can have quite a bit of variation from one year to the next in terms of who might be in their third grade classrooms. And we have, in our conversations with them, been very clear that if they've got formative data about those students when they were in second grade, that still builds in a growth trajectory for those learners in third grade, that is certainly an acceptable alternative to a goal that's just 1% arbitrarily above a previous mark. So we really are making this very much about the students and their success.
Mary?
Well, just to say that I think it's important as we roll out the teaching complex, and of course we knew they were evolving, but I think from the board standpoint, we've had, Rudy's new things were said and done prior to his arrival and so forth, but I think it's just important going forward that we're crystal clear in our communications and our expectations to local districts, so that there isn't any misunderstanding about what the mutual expectations are, not just the expectations from the state to the local districts and colleges and universities, but the other way. I think just as we go on and as you get your staff together, it can just be sharper.
Okay, thank you. So we're at the public comment section of the agenda, and we are doing that a little bit differently this time, so I'll sort of talk about the ground rules. We're going to have Seth, who is, did I forget something? Oh, the dashboard, thank you. Okay, thanks. So he's going to do the dashboard. Is that?
I think we don't actually need testimony on the dashboard. It was included in the packet that was sent out to the board, and we are working with the Department of Administrative Services to get it uploaded onto the website so that the public can also see and use it as a thought tool. We're having a few technical difficulties with that uploading, but we know we can work through it.
Okay, thank you. And Hannah, did you have a question?
Well, we received the reports from the Early Learning Council. Now, is that on another agenda that we're going to discuss those, or is that a couple of questions from you?
Madam Vice Chair and members of the board, what I've decided in the remaking of the agenda and the structure here is there are some items which, at least in my judgment, would be easily consumed by virtue of just simply sending them out to you for your own edification. And should you have questions about it here at the board, obviously to the extent that the chair provides, you certainly should feel free in asking those questions. We've got staff here who can respond to them. But for purposes of both brevity and clarity of the meeting and its focus, to send out or to have an ending of the meeting function as a one more report, just sort of a set of reports, frankly, sub-optimizes your time, and frankly, it generally happens at an hour, but it sub-optimizes the staff's time as well. So I've sent them out to you. If you have questions, again, to the extent that the chair would like, more than happy to answer them now, but that's how I would like going forward to meet.
Okay. And I appreciated getting them early so we could actually get through them. On the House Bill 4165 and 11 Joint Work Group, one of the things that's pointed out here around what's working and what's not working is the connection between K-12. There's a real issue between K-12 and early learning. And I'm just wondering, in the work that we're doing, how we create some articulation there between those two, and which one of our subcommittees or how that work's going to be done.
Would you?
You're talking about 4165 and the joint work with the Interagency Council,
right,
and the Early Learning Council. That was a work group that met 4 times, and it was a joint group together. And so they're still going to continue to meet, Hannah, because they've just reached this initial report. What are you asking in terms of?
Well, it was a survey, and they were asking what works well and what doesn't work well, and the articulation between K-12 was seen as not working well in both cases. And so I'm just wondering what we're doing to connect those two entities so that we can actually, I know we're doing the kindergarten readiness assessment, and that's going to be one big step, but are there other strategies that we're using to connect K-12 with early learning?
I think your data system will be another example of that, because I think that there's probably not that connection of what we have prior to kindergarten. But then some of the strategies that we're actually looking at with the Race to the Top grant would be exactly that, is how can we create those opportunities for those transitions to work better.
If I may.
The other thing is there's a natural barrier because you've got early learning environments in private centers that, how do we get them to introduce themselves to the school? And those are some of the discussions.
From the standpoint of process, if I understood your question, my intent is that many of the items that are currently in the hands of staff now and are working through some of those sort of deep tissue problems should in fact, we're going to wait, I'm going to ask the board to wait until such time as the staff is actually ready to bring forward a set of recommendations. At the point when they do that, it then becomes the subject of discussion here at the board meeting. And should the board decide, or should there be ample evidence that we really need to study this deeper, or the board would like more additional information and so forth, it would then appropriately go directly to the committee, to which either the board chair or I may assign, or it would go back to staff to try to work it through. But the idea here as a process is not everything has to go to the committee. Some things the board can hear, the staff can hear, and they can go back and try to make the modification. But should there be a need for it, obviously then it would go to the renewal to come back from the committee with a specific recommendation.
Something I'd like to add, I think our professional organizations can start working on this and bring together best models. Like we talked at the Superintendent's Vision and Policy Committee about the great work Gladstone has done around early intervention. We talked about as superintendents, we need to become a learning community where we start looking at the models that seem to have really moved the dial on this, and then that could support us. So I love having the document so that now we can go back and start moving in our professional organizations about how do we get there. I don't think anyone would disagree that alignment between 0 and K-12 is really critical to really reaching the achievement we need. So lots of ways to get at it, I think.
And I do know that the council, the Early Learning Council, wants to explore this one further too.
Madam Chair, if I could add, I think it's really great that the document calls out something that I think that we all know, and that is that we need to coordinate better between early childhood and K-12. So it just kind of lays it right out there for us, and it's certainly work that John and I are looking at and partnering on. I know at the Superintendent's Vision Group, we talked a lot about not only what's happening in Gladstone, but also David Douglas as potential models. And it just puts it out there for everybody that here's work that we need to do, and it really emphasizes this is the possibility of what this brings to bear. So our partnership, we can really look at that, and I look forward to really identifying some specific actions that we have an opportunity to bring back to you to consider.
There was some momentum in the forums where people were actually sitting at the same tables having conversations, that I was just wondering where we're going so that we don't let that stop, but just keep pushing. The only other request I have is from the Early Learning Council. They had the survey report. It was really hard to understand the report without seeing the survey. So if I can get a copy of the actual survey, that would be helpful to better understand what was.
I'm seeing a head nod that we'll be getting that to you. So, any other comments before we move to public testimony? Thank you. So the way we'll be doing public testimony today is Seth over here. You want to raise your hand so we all know who you are? He is going to be the person who announces who's signed up for public testimony, and he's going to be the timekeeper. So let's not shoot the messenger. He's been assigned that work. And what we're saying is that every person has 2 minutes to give public testimony. So the opportunity that provides is to be really clear about what is the message you want us to receive. And also, if you can deliver something in writing, that's great too, because then you can leave it with us and we would be able to look at it after that. So we'll just begin now, and do you want to let us know who our first person is?
Jason Trombley.
And as Jason comes out, how will you be signaling to Jason that his 2 minutes are up?
Probably a 30-second
Okay.
warning.
Is Jason still here? I guess we have 4 people who want to testify, right?
Eduardo Angulo.
Good afternoon, Governor Kit Saber, members of the Oregon Education Investment Board, and Dr. Rudy Crew. For the record, my name is Eduardo Angulo, Executive Director of the Salem Kaiser Coalition for Equality. We are a coalition of the largest Latino organizations that serve the Latino community and its children in the state of Oregon. We are also a member organization of the Oregon Alliance for Education Equity. For the past 21 years, there have been an urgent need in Oregon to have an honest and inclusive conversation around our public education system and its English language learners funding formula, along with the academic achievement and equity. As you all know, back in 1992, the Oregon legislature approved a distribution computation in the ORS 327, 013 and ORS 336079, which specify extra money for English language learners education. The legislature agreed to give this, to give local school boards and administrators the discretion to allocate those extra monies where they saw it would better help the ELL students to read, write, and do math at grade level. In real time, that has been a disgrace for the state of Oregon. Case in point, 8 years ago in 2004, several Salem Kaiser community and education leaders who were members of the Budget Advisory Committee, they looked at recommendations and they issued recommendations for the Salem Kaiser Public Schools and Budget Committee, in where they asked for those monies that those kids brought to be tracked. 8 years later, that hasn't happened. They asked for those students to get more money because of needs. That hasn't happened. And we find ourselves with a 55% graduation rate of these English language learners, and we find that they bring in over $24 million to their education, and only around $10 million are allocated to help these students. And as you saw, the Oregonian and all the newspapers, they have been telling us we need to do something different. The Oregon LearnWorks, they gave some recommendations to help us guide the conversation in how we can include the ELLs in moving our public education forward with real education reform. That hasn't happened. We need the support of all the Oregon Education Investment Boards, Dr. Rudy Crew, and everyone that listens out there. This is unethical. It has been wrong for 21 years, and it's still wrong. It might not be illegal, but it has been unethical for 21 years. We're leaving these kids behind, and with that, we're leaving the progress of Oregon behind. So when we talk about the 40-40-20, we don't solve this issue now. We're not going to have a trajectory. Thank you so much.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
Tom Olson and Steve Buell.
Thank you very much. I'm assuming that I'll have 2 minutes and then Steve will have 2 minutes. We happen to be the oldest members of Oregon Save Our Schools, and the reason you don't see more of them here is they're working at Mentor Graphics or as parents of preschool children and as teachers. So they left it to us old timers. In fact, our testimony's in large print. We hope to add some clarity today about your discussion about power and authority with regard to achievement compacts. As you know, achievement compacts were sold to the legislature on the grounds that we really needed it to get the NCLB waiver. And then Senate Bill 1581 clearly set forth that the OEIB is responsible for establishing only the form of the compacts and the outcomes and general measures of progress. In my school district, we now have 350 performance targets as a result of that. Senate Bill 1581 also requires that the OEIB inform districts of their actual funding level and the funding that would be full funding as identified by the state's own QEM model process. Senate Bill 15.1 then requires the state to place the compacts and the funding and achievement data in the hands of the districts, the governing body of the districts, the local school board, to identify target numbers and percentages of growth as part of their budgeting process. As you know, this year, in the rush to push it through, OEIB had not provided the amount of funding in time for district budgeting. Districts didn't have previous year's statistics to set as benchmarks with regard to their achievement compacts submitted by July 1. These failures on the part of the state hampered the ability of districts to fulfill the intent and specific language of 1581.
Unbelievably, even with these state failures, in September, Dr. Rudy Crew declared that 69 districts' achievement compacts were not acceptable and demanded resubmittal with higher targets. He failed to state in advance what his review standards were for making this determination. Districts discovered his standards only when they received their rejection letters from him. Isn't the entire purpose of standards to be as a guide, not a gotcha? This is where Oregon Save Our Schools moves from criticizing the overall structure of the bill. We believe that Dr. Crew, under the auspices of you and the governor, is following neither the legislative intent nor the precise language of the law. Here is the basis of our opinion. Senate Bill 1581 does not provide any authority for Crew's call for resubmittals. The law states that the responsibility of setting performance targets is solely that of the local school board. Section 14 of the Act specifies the governing body of the education entity shall set the targets for the outcomes and measures of progress it intends to achieve and may add other measures approved by the OEIB. And then it also says in Senate Bill 1581, it states that the direction and control authority of the Chief Education Officer is limited to matters related to the design and organization of the state's education system. These two sections clearly show that Dr. Crew is acting outside the authority specified in Senate Bill 1581 when his recent actions override both of these sections of the law. Our organization has held discussions with many legislators about the achievement compacts. They are upset at Crew's recent rejection of 1/3 of them. It is clear to us that the legislative purpose of the mandate was to protect local control and to provide greater flexibility for our school boards to act according to their unique needs. If Dr. Crew is able to act outside of the confines of the law, these protections are lost. This behavior should not be allowed to stand. The governor, OEIB, and Crew must operate within the law as written. Oregon Save Our Schools urges the governor, OEIB, and its officers to immediately correct these errors and make sure this kind of overreach doesn't happen again. We know that the OEIB does not respond to public testimony, and the governor never stays to listen to testimony. But we are requesting your formal assurances that you will follow the legislative intent and the specific language of the law, and that you will take corrective action to come into compliance with the law. We are, as always, open for discussion on these and other matters. Thank you very much.
And we have written testimony that we can distribute both sides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for our public testimony. Any last minute comments by the board before we adjourn? We're adjourned.